Hello friends, how are you? I want to ask a question. Are we believers in steak on the plate while you wait, or pie in the sky when you die? Today I want to focus on steak on the plate because I'm not sure the church has Jesus' good news if all we offer is pie in the sky. You see, in the early days of Christianity, our faith was regarded as a pretty good deal. If you were a slave and someone else owned your life and could kill you with a whim, then following the God who made sense of injustice and offered resurrection was good news. And in the Middle Ages, we had something to offer when everybody lived in terror of early death, when it was common to have a quarter of your children die before they were 5, and when there was little to pick you up when weather failed, with starvation following. In those days, pie in the sky was good news. And in early modernity, when membership of the Church of England led to good careers and status in society, then our good news meant we could climb the social ladder. But the reality is now that modern medicine and good nutrition and warm housing and safe employment have destroyed many causes of poverty. People have steak on their plate while they wait and aren't anxious about pie in the sky when they die. If that's how you see things, where is the benefit in joining a church? So when we proclaim good news, what are we inviting people to? What is good news about inviting people to come and be cold on a Sunday morning? What is good news about joining a PCC that worries about money and keeping the roof up? What is good news, as we found recently, about going to church on a Sunday morning when England are in the World Cup final? Today people have steak on their plate. People aren't worried about pies in the sky, because if they believe in God, they mostly believe that God is love. And if they don't believe in God, well, they know how to have good community, a good life, and they're okay. So my question today is to ask what constitutes the gospel, the good news today. What is it about the gospel of Jesus Christ that can compel us into a new vision of life that is still unambiguously good, compelling, and attractive? To do that, we're going to look back into old scripture and the experience of Israel, Moses, and their journey towards the promised land. The good news for experience for Israel, if you like. And in our reading, in chapter 3 of Exodus, we have Moses' encounter with the living God. What we already know of Moses is that he already burns with the desire to liberate Israel, to the extent that he's murdered an Egyptian. But today we find him on the run and in hiding in Midian, where he's channeled his leadership potential into tending sheep. You might say his bid for leadership failed him, and so he settled into a half-life. He can't lead for people, but he can lead sheep. And now, in chapter 3 of Exodus, we see him meeting God. A common theme of meeting God, you see it in Moses, Abraham, the apostles, and many others, seems to be God stretching our vision from half-life to extraordinary life. Something shifts from what we are to what we might be. And the good news for Moses is to move from being a shepherd of sheep to, at last, becoming shepherd of Israel. As shepherd of Israel, he bears God's vision as he leads Israel to move from making bricks to build Pharaoh's temples to builders of a nation under God. This pattern recurs when people meet God. They're invited to become a fully flavoured version of themselves, and in walking into that personhood, they invite others into that new life. We see the same with Jesus' disciples. Do you remember Jesus meeting the disciples when they were fishing? And he says, "Follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men." They follow. They become their full selves, and over time they transform the world as they invite people to enjoy Jesus as Lord, not simply suffer Caesar as Lord. Nevertheless, the ancient gods and their social ills are distant memories for our communities today. Nobody is now fooled into believing that Caesar is God anymore, and people of good conscience are 10 a penny. So what do we offer when we introduce people to meet with God? Well, first of all, let's go back to the people of Israel. Do you remember they were called from slavery to the promised land, from lawlessness and a slave mind to a freed soul with the law of God? Did that therefore mean that as soon as they arrived in Canaan, they were new people and that all the ills were resolved? Not at all. They may have arrived in a better place, but they were not really right in themselves, and consequently, having exited the oppression of the Egyptians, they were pretty quick to create their own oppression, their own ways of enslaving themselves. For example, we hear in the story that the people of Israel wanted their own king, knowing full well that this king will tax them and make them fight in his armies and take their daughters to be his wives. Moses' God would do none of those things. It's almost like the slave in them needed to recreate a master. We see this pattern repeated throughout history and scripture, the pattern of problem solved, but not really entry into life as we long for life to be. And we could, of course, simply regard this world as it is as good enough and leave it at that. But we know, don't we, that something within us always beats towards something better. Why is that? Well, my wondering is whether our vision of good is actually divine seed, nudging at the concrete path of our souls, waiting to burst through the cracks. This vision is captured in the imagery of the original creation story in Eden. Look into that story in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis, and you'll start to see an image of created beauty that actually we long to dwell within. Who wouldn't want to live in a world that is gentle and giving, where the work of feeding our families is as easy as turning up and picking the fruits off a tree? Who wouldn't want relationships free of conflict, mutually beneficial, innocent, collaborative, not competitive? And instead of a God who rules us and grinds us with new laws, who wouldn't want a friendship with God who walks with us in the cool of the day? When put in those terms, we start to see that our high-quality modern Western life is many steps short of the divine vision of good life, of good news. And yet actually, so is church. You see, your neighbours spend most of their lives trying to earn enough money to have a decent pension. They will work 2 jobs for 40 years to give the children great experiences and to live in a great house. And to them, this seems better than what church offers. Why? Because actually, when you look at modern lifestyles, what you actually see is a form of wage slavery. Nothing close to what we see in Genesis. What I see is kind of another form of feudalism, in which we may not be owned by the local lord, but we're certainly owned by a mortgage. So I'm left wondering, might the decline of church in our country actually be because we've forgotten our own vision of the good life? We get lost in worrying about church attendance rather than losing ourselves in the vision of God's beauty. We consume ourselves with worry about how to keep the roof on rather than being consumed with a passion to live in the purpose of God. And in doing these things, we've turned the birthright of God's kingdom into a mess of pottage that is tasteless and drear. Of course people look at the church and instead choose rugby or football or anything. Our solution, therefore, isn't very complicated. As with Moses, what would it look like for you to recapture your vision of God's life, of your best life? And like Moses, what would it look like for us to recapture a vision of healing the world, of freeing slaves, of walking together towards the vision of the good that God imprints on our hearts in our longings? When that is our mindset, the invitation changes. We aren't necessarily then offering pie in the sky when we die. We might not even be offering steak on the plate while you wait. Those 2 things aren't good enough. Perhaps we'd be offering something much more exciting. How about this? A life infused with the mystery, beauty, and purpose of God. A purpose that infects and delights and transforms society. And a journey together that makes Sunday mornings the most exciting time of the week. That's something I want to have, and it's something I want to give. So shall we?